Have you ever stood on a train platform and felt the world tilt as someone you love disappeared into the horizon? That hollow ache, the moment where minutes stretch into lifetimes, this is where her story begins. Her name was Evelyn Hart, though in her youth, everyone simply called her Evie. She was 17 when she first met James Whitfield, the son of a local carpenter. He was 20. With calloused hands and a smile that made even the strictest church ladies soften. They met at the harvest dance in 1938, under lanterns that swung like restless stars. From the first moment he asked her to dance, she knew. It wasn't infatuation, wasn't girlish whim, it was the kind of certainty that roots itself deep. When he spun her across the floor, the world blurred, leaving only his steady gaze and her heartbeat racing to match the fiddle. For a year, they were inseparable. Walks along the river, letters slipped between fence posts, dreams shared in whispers beneath oak trees. James promised that once he finished his apprenticeship, he'd build them a cottage on the edge of town. Evelyn, shy but unshakable, believed him with the fervor only the young can carry. But war has a way of finding its way into even the quietest towns. By 1940, Europe was already ablaze, and soon, America called its young men forward. The day James received his draft notice, Evelyn was there. She remembered the way his hands trembled as he folded the letter. She remembered the silence between them, broken only by the sound of cicadas droning in the summer heat, and she remembered the words he whispered as he pressed his forehead to hers. "Wait for me, Evie, however long it takes. Wait." She promised she would. The last time she saw him, the station was crowded with families holding handkerchiefs, waving flags, swallowing tears. Evelyn stood on tiptoe, clutching James's hand until the conductor barked for passengers to board. He kissed her once, quick and desperate, then jogged toward the waiting train. She shouted his name, and he turned, one foot on the step, eyes bright with something between hope and fear. He raised his hand in a half salute, half wave, and then he was gone, swallowed by the train, the smoke, the war. Evelyn pressed her palm against her chest as if to hold in her heart, watching until the last car vanished into the horizon. Around her, other families wept, but she stood still, her tears unshed, her promise unbroken. She told herself he would return. He had to. In those early months, letters came regularly. Blue envelopes edged with red and white stripes, filled with his handwriting clumsy, smudged, but alive. He told her about the barracks, the endless drills, the smell of oil and sweat. He asked about the river, about the oak tree, about whether she still wore the ribbon he had given her. She wrote back faithfully, her words spilling across pages, filling them with news of home, with reassurances, with dreams of the life they would have when he returned. Neighbors teased her gently. "Still writing, Evie? You'll wear out your pen." But she only smiled. He'll need words to hold on to, same as I do. But as the war deepened, the letters grew fewer. Months stretched into silence. Rumors spread of casualties, of missing regiments, of ships lost at sea. Each day, Evelyn waited at the mailbox, breath caught in her chest, praying for the sound of paper against metal. Sometimes it came, sometimes it didn't. But she never stopped waiting. This is not just the story of a woman who loved. It is the story of a woman who waited through seasons, through years, through a lifetime. A woman whose faith outlasted silence, whose patience endured even as the world urged her to move on. And one day, when she had almost forgotten how to hope, the past knocked on her door with news she never expected. But to understand that ending, we must begin with her first wait, the girl on the platform, clutching a promise like a lantern against the dark. The war changed the rhythm of the town. Factories roared day and night. Ration lines stretched down Main Street, and black curtains hung in windows for the nightly blackouts. Evelyn adapted as everyone did. She sewed uniforms at the mill, planted victory gardens with her mother, learned to stretch sugar and flour until they became luxuries again. But nothing altered the fact that every morning she walked to the mailbox. For the first year, James's letters came often enough. He wrote about mud, about sleepless nights, about the absurdity of trying to shave in freezing water. Sometimes he pressed wildflowers between the pages, flattened tokens from fields far away. Evelyn tucked each one carefully into a box beneath her bed. Then the gaps began. 2 months with no word. 3. Once, half a year. When an envelope finally arrived, she held it against her cheek before daring to open it. "Still breathing," he would scribble, "still dreaming of you." But by 1944, the silence grew longer, deeper. Neighbors noticed. The grocer's wife clucked her tongue. "Still waiting, Evie? A pretty girl like you shouldn't waste her youth." Her father, kind but practical, urged gently. "Sweetheart, you can't build a life on a maybe." Evelyn only smiled. "It isn't a maybe, Daddy. He asked me to wait, so I will." The words became her shield. She repeated them like a prayer when doubt seeped in. Suitors came, as they do when a young woman grows into her 20s. A young mechanic, steady and polite, asked her to the cinema. A widowed schoolteacher brought her books of poetry. A farmer's son offered to build her a porch swing. Each time, Evelyn thanked them kindly and declined. Her friends shook their heads. "You're letting life pass you by." But Evelyn knew her choice was not about stubbornness. It was about faithfulness to James, to her own heart. Some families in town received telegrams with gold stars. Evelyn's stomach knotted whenever the Western Union boy pedaled down her street. She memorized the sound of his bicycle bell, prayed never to hear it stop at her door, and it never did. But the absence of bad news was not the same as the presence of good. Each day without word was its own battlefield. Each silent season stretched her patience thinner but never broke it. Years slipped past. The war ended. Church bells rang. Parades filled the streets. Soldiers came home to waving banners and tearful reunions. Evelyn stood at the station again, just as she had years before, scanning faces in the crowd. Husbands lifted wives. Children clutched fathers. But James never appeared. Still, she waited. She bought her own cottage, the one James had once promised to build. She planted roses by the porch, kept a lamp lit in the window. Every evening, she walked to the river, ribbon in her hair, as though he might step off a boat at any moment. Her 20s became 30s. Friends married, had children, grew old enough to scold teenagers. Evelyn became Miss Hart, the dependable neighbor, the aunt who baked pies, the teacher who stayed after class. She carried her quiet faith like a lantern no one could extinguish. People whispered less often as the years went by. Pity gave way to respect, then to awe. "She's still waiting," newcomers were told, as if Evelyn's life were a local legend. By the time she reached 50, Evelyn's hair had silver threads, but her eyes remained steadfast. Each birthday, she placed James's letters on the kitchen table and reread them aloud, as though he might hear. And then, one autumn evening, as leaves skittered along the porch, a knock came at her door, bringing news she had stopped expecting. The knock on the door came just after dusk, when Evelyn had settled with a cup of tea by the lamp. She wasn't expecting company. The children she taught had grown and scattered, her parents long passed, her evenings given to reading and quiet walks. Visitors were rare. She rose slowly, smoothed her skirt, and opened the door. A man stood on the porch, a stranger, gray at the temples, hat in hand. His overcoat was damp from the mist. "Miss Hart?" he asked, his voice carrying both hesitation and reverence. "Yes," she said, puzzled. He extended an envelope. "This was among my father's belongings. He served in the 81st Infantry. He asked that, if ever I found you, I should deliver it." Her hand trembled as she took it. The envelope was worn, edges frayed, addressed in handwriting she hadn't seen in decades but recognized instantly. James. She sat at the table, the stranger politely waiting in the doorway. Her fingers traced the faded ink of her name before she dared to break the seal. Inside was a single sheet, creased, and yellowed. My dearest Evie, if you read this, it means fate was not kind enough to return me. But know that every day I carried you with me, your laugh, your ribbon, the promise of the cottage by the river. Do not mourn me too long. Live, teach, plant roses. If I cannot come back to you, then let my love come back in the way you live. Always, James. Her vision blurred. She pressed the page to her chest, rocking gently, as though she could close the gap of half a century with the strength of her heartbeat. The stranger cleared his throat. My father said James saved his life, pulled him out of fire at the cost of his own. He spoke of you often, said James's only regret was leaving someone waiting. Evelyn managed to smile through her tears. He was right about that. The man tipped his hat. I thought you should know. It mattered to him that you were remembered. When he left, the night pressed close, the quiet thicker than before. But Evelyn's cottage glowed warm, lit by the lamp, the roses outside shivering in the wind. At night, she sat by the window, James's words echoing, Do not mourn me too long. Live, teach, plant roses. She thought of the children she had guided, the pies she had baked, the neighbors she had comforted. In a way, she had done exactly what he asked, lived faithfully, carrying love as discipline, not despair. But there was also something more. She had kept her promise. She had waited. And in the end, he had spoken back across the years, affirming that her waiting had not been in vain. The letter closed one door, but opened another. If James had entrusted his words to comrades, what else lay hidden? Were there other letters, journals, recollections? Evelyn folded the page carefully, placed it back in the envelope, and whispered, I'm still listening. Because even after decades, sometimes the story is not finished. For a time, Evelyn lived in a haze of quiet revelation. The letter from James rested on her bedside table, folded neatly in a glass frame. Each morning she woke to the sight of his handwriting, a reminder that her faith had not been one-sided. The townspeople's whispers changed. Where once they had pitied her, now they spoke with reverence. She was right to wait, they murmured. She knew. Children grew up hearing her story as a parable, not of wasted years, but of devotion that transcended distance. The grocer's wife, who had once scolded Evelyn for throwing her life away, now placed an extra apple in her bag, murmuring, For the roses in your garden. The mechanic who had courted her long ago tipped his hat in quiet respect whenever they passed. Evelyn accepted the kindness with grace, but she never sought validation. She had never waited for the approval of neighbors, only for James. In the classroom, her lessons took on a new weight. She told her students that patience was not weakness, that loyalty was not foolishness, that hope was an act of courage. She did not preach James's name, but his spirit wove through every story she told. Children carried those lessons home. Parents began to speak of Miss Hart not only as a teacher, but as a keeper of wisdom. Her waiting had become more than personal. It was communal. A lantern hung high enough for others to see their way. In her cottage garden, the roses bloomed more fiercely than ever. She tended them daily, humming hymns, her hands steady despite the arthritis creeping into her joints. Neighbors swore that her roses never wilted as others did. They grow from her faith, they said. Each year on James's birthday, she placed a bouquet by the riverbank, whispering the words she had repeated since girlhood. I'm still here. One autumn evening, nearly a year after the first letter arrived, another knock sounded on her door. Evelyn's heart jolted. Old reflexes never die. This time it was a woman, younger, carrying a worn satchel. Are you Miss Evelyn Hart? Yes, Evelyn said cautiously. The woman opened her satchel and withdrew a packet tied with twine. My grandfather served with James. When he passed, we found this among his things. He had meant to return it to you, but never managed. Inside were 3 more letters, James's handwriting unmistakable. They were dated later than the one she had already received, one from the hospital where he recovered from wounds, one from the barracks before a final campaign, and one with no date at all, as though written in a hurry. Evelyn read them slowly, her lips trembling. In each, James wrote of his longing, his determination to return, his fear that fate might intervene. The last letter ended with a single haunting line: "If I cannot find my way back to you in this life, I will find you in the next." Evelyn folded the letters carefully, her chest heavy but her heart unburdened. She had lived decades on a promise, and now she knew that James had carried the same promise to his final breath. That night, she sat by the fire, the letters spread across her lap. She did not weep, not as she once had. Instead, she smiled, the lines on her face deepened by the glow of the flames. She whispered into the stillness, "You did return, James, in the only way you could." Outside, the wind rattled the windows, but inside the cottage the air felt warm, as though an old embrace had finally circled her shoulders. Evelyn placed all the letters back into the box beneath her bed. For the first time in years, she felt no need to wait by the mailbox. Yet as she blew out the lamp, she thought she heard footsteps along the riverbank, soft and steady, like the echo of a promise kept. The story was not finished because Evelyn still had one more lesson to give, and the town had one more truth to learn. The years after the letters arrived were the gentlest of Evelyn's life. It was as if the burden she had carried for half a century had finally set itself down beside her, no longer a weight, but a companion. She still woke early, still tended her roses, still taught the few private lessons parents asked of her. But she did so with a lighter step, a softer laugh, a peace that radiated to all who knew her. By then, Evelyn was no longer simply a neighbor or a teacher. She had become something else entirely, a story. Mothers told their children about the woman who had waited. Young couples, nervous about distance or hardship, visited her garden for counsel. "How did you do it?" they would ask, standing awkwardly among the roses. And Evelyn would smile, her eyes crinkling, and say, "I chose every morning. Waiting is not one decision, it is 1,000 little ones. Each day I asked myself if I still loved him. Each day the answer was yes. That is how you keep a promise." Her words spread beyond the town. Newspapers wrote features, "The Woman Who Waited 50 Years." Photographers captured her beside her rose bushes, holding the faded photograph of James, her ribbon still tied neatly in her hair. Some readers dismissed her story as old-fashioned, even foolish. But many more found themselves moved, writing letters of admiration, confessing that her devotion gave them courage in their own lives. Even with recognition, Evelyn's life remained humble. She never sought crowds or applause. Instead, she marked her evenings with quiet rituals. She lit a lamp in the window, not because she expected James to walk down the lane she knew that chapter was closed, but because the gesture reminded her that love is both a welcome and a beacon. She read James's letters on winter nights, sometimes aloud, as though speaking the words could weave their voices together once more. And on summer mornings, she walked to the river with a small basket of roses, scattering petals across the water. Children often followed, curious. She let them help, explaining, "The river carries memories, just as it carries rain. Nothing is ever truly gone." One spring afternoon, a young woman came to her gate. She couldn't have been older than 20. Nervous, clutching her gloves, she asked, "Miss Hart, may I speak with you?" Evelyn invited her in, poured tea, and listened. The girl confessed she was engaged, but her fiancé had been drafted overseas. "I'm terrified, Miss Hart. Everyone tells me not to cling too tightly, that I'll only end up hurt. But I can't help it, I love him. What should I do?" Evelyn reached across the table, laid her wrinkled hand over the girl's trembling one, and said softly, "Do not let fear dictate how you love. If you choose to wait, then wait with courage. And if fate has another plan, then let your love be the lantern that lights your way forward. Either way, love will never be wasted." The girl wept with relief. She left Evelyn's cottage carrying not just advice, but an inheritance of strength. As Evelyn aged into her 70s, then 80s, her body slowed. Arthritis bent her hands, her steps shortened, but her eyes never lost their brightness. She no longer walked to the river each evening, but she asked children to bring her pebbles from the shore so she could line them on her windowsill. "Each one is a memory," she explained. "They belong to all of us." When neighbors visited, she told stories of her girlhood, of the harvest dance, of the platform where James waved one last time. She didn't tell the stories with sorrow, but with gratitude. "Not everyone is given a love that endures," she said. "Mine did." Even in silence. The townspeople began to call her Aunt Evelyn, a title that carried affection and respect. And though she never bore children of her own, her influence rippled through generations. Students who had once sat in her classroom now brought their children to meet her, eager for them to glimpse the woman whose life had become a parable. On her 90th birthday, the town gathered at the church hall. Banners hung, pies lined the tables, music filled the air. Evelyn sat in a chair of honor, her hands folded in her lap, overwhelmed by the love surrounding her. Then the mayor stepped forward with a package wrapped in brown paper. "This came to the Historical Society last month," he said. "We thought it belonged to you." Inside was a journal, weathered and thin, belonging to one of James's comrades. In its pages, a single entry had been underlined. Whitfield spoke of Evelyn again today, said if he did not return, he hoped she would know he had carried her to the very end. He called her his anchor, his home. The hall grew silent as Evelyn read aloud. Tears streamed down, faces young and old. She closed the journal gently and whispered, "Then he did come home, after all, in words, in love, in the way you remember him with me." In the months that followed, Evelyn grew frail. One evening, as twilight painted her cottage in gold, she gathered the young and old around her bed. She asked them to listen closely. "People think waiting is passive," she said. "But it is not. It is active faith. It is work. Every day you must plant roses, teach children, light lamps, scatter petals, even when your heart aches. Waiting is not the absence of life. It is life lived with love at the center." She paused, her breath shallow, her ribbon still tied neatly in her hair. "Do not be afraid to wait for what matters, but do not forget to live while you wait." Those were her final words to the town. When Evelyn passed, the entire town attended her funeral. Children placed roses on her casket. Teachers read aloud passages from James's letters. And the mayor declared the day a remembrance of love that outlasted time. Her cottage became a small museum. Visitors still come, reading the letters framed on the wall, sitting on the porch swing James never built but that Evelyn installed herself. The roses bloom brighter than ever, as though watered by memory. And the story of the woman who waited is told to each new generation not as a tale of loss, but as a testament that love, when carried faithfully, can shape not only two lives but entire communities. And so, dear listener, the question comes to you. What are you waiting for in your own life? Is there someone whose memory you keep alive with your faith, your patience, your love? Evelyn's story is not about wasted years. It is about choosing, each day, to keep a promise, even when the world insists it is foolish. Share in the comments. Have you or someone in your family ever carried a love or a promise across years? Subscribe to Years Ago Stories for more forgotten voices and timeless lessons. Because one day, your story may be the lantern someone else needs to see their way forward.